All right, so in this video, we're going to continue going through the social changes or social effects of industrialization. And in this video, we're going to take a look at social classes and the social hierarchy. So, industrialization changed the social hierarchy just as it changed the rest of European society. So, if you remember, prior to this, we had the old, I'll just draw it quickly here, the old feudal triangle. So there was like the king or the nobility on the top, and then as you moved down, you had more laborers. So this was the social class structure prior to industrialization. We've gone over that ad nauseum. You probably know it backwards and forwards, so we're not going to dwell on this. So this system was the product of agriculture. That was the product of agriculture. What we're going to see now are seeds that grow as a result of the start of towns. So remember that outside the feudal system, and this eventually leads to the feudal system's decline, cities and towns kind of inserted themselves into the social structure because they had money. And remember, money always equals power and influence. So even though these cities and towns weren't part of this feudal system, they did start to insert themselves somewhere in the middle of it as people with a lot of money. And these guys would go on to become the merchants. And remember that the merchants worked with monarchs to ensure their property rights. I think that kind of covers where we are at the start of the Industrial Revolution. The only thing that I will add to this, and I think we've mentioned this before, is that these guys become known as the middle class because they had more money than the poor people, but less power than the nobility. So they do kind of fit there right in the middle. It's just not exactly clear why. They just kind of forced their way into the system. Now, as we get into the Industrial Revolution, so as this process progresses, landowners become less powerful or less influential. And factory owners become more influential. We've seen the landowners attempt to hold on to power through the Corn Laws. Like, the point of the Corn Laws was to have the landowners maintain their power by not allowing grain to be imported into Great Britain. It's not going to work, but it is their last gasp of holding on to the power they once had. And as industrialization progresses, factory owners become more influential because they have the money. These guys have money. And so we get a total reorganization of this system. So we're going to end up now with two classes. There's two classes of people now. There is the middle class, the rich people, and the word that we would use to describe the middle class is the term that Marx would use to describe them: the bourgeoisie. So the middle class, the people that had the money, these are the industrial capitalists, and we might also call them the employers. These guys are rich. At first, they don't necessarily have political power, but we're not worried about that right now. We're just talking about social class. And these guys are rich, and they have the money, they have the influence. They just don't quite yet have the political power you would expect them to, but we'll worry about that when we start talking about the political side of this. The other class is the working class, the workers. The term that Marx would use for these guys is the proletariat. These are industrial workers. You might call these guys the employees, and generally speaking, these guys are poor. So you might ask yourself now, well, where did the old nobility go? Most of them bought into factories. So if the old nobility had money, they became middle class bourgeoisie. If they didn't have any money, then they were kind of stuck on their rural estates, making do with whatever kind of money they could make doing agriculture. This distinction is at the heart of socialism, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We'll worry about that when we get to the political side of this. Difference. But we'll worry about that when we start talking about politics. So instead of going down that rabbit hole, which is a long rabbit hole and will take us a few days to get through, let's look at the ways the different social classes, so these new social classes, express themselves. So we'll look at a few different ways in which the middle class and the working class might do things. So we'll look at a variety of different ways that they might spend their time, their money, their energy. So one way that we could see a difference between these two social classes is how they donated money. So there's a difference. Here's a difference in how they would express themselves. What kinds of groups do they donate money to? So the working class typically donated to things like mutual aid societies, mutual aid societies, which are basically like in case someone is sick or injured or dies, these things would kick in and help the family. So you might donate to a mutual aid society, or you might donate to a labor union to help your conditions at work. The middle class, they would typically donate money to charities or political organizations that would benefit them. So early charities might be something like maybe something like early animal rights, maybe something towards women's suffrage, things like that. So think of the middle class donating to things like charity galas. Galas? You know, where everybody dresses up and they have a nice dinner. You've seen these things before. Another way that we might see a difference is in how they spend their leisure time. Again, we'll start with the working class. The working class typically didn't have a lot of free time. Because they had to spend most of their time working to make ends meet. So usually they got a half day Sunday to go to church. That time was spent for church, not for relaxing. But they relaxed anyway, and they would usually, well, let's not say usually, many workers got so drunk on Sunday they couldn't work on Mondays. So they reached a compromise. The workers and their employers reached a compromise. They would get a half day on Saturday and Sunday off. And they weren't being very productive on Mondays anyway, so you might as well give them the day off. So this is the birth of the modern weekend. It's also why, if you're a soccer fan, it's also why Premier League soccer, or football, if you're European, starts at 3 p.m. on Saturday, because that's when they would get off of work. Additionally, having Sundays off allowed kids to go to school if they were working all week. So they would get one day of school if they worked all day or all week in the factory. And so this becomes known as Sunday school. Which was done after the church services. This is probably a good time to bring up the religion that was very popular amongst the working people, which was Methodism. So this is the church that a lot of working people used. It was called Methodism, and it was founded by a guy named John Wesley in 1740. And it was an attempt to reform the Anglican Church. So Wesley really focused on charity and helping poor people, which is why it was popular with the working class. Now, it's called Methodism because they were very rigid in their services and beliefs. And so Methodism was a derogatory term amongst other Anglicans given to them. And like so many other times in history, they just owned their phrase. They owned the derogatory term and they made it their own. And so they became known as Methodists. And so Sunday school was a product of Methodism. And coincidentally, for those of you watching here in Florida, this is also where we get the name Wesley Chapel from. That's where the town the school is in that got its name. When we're also thinking about working class leisure time, because they didn't have a lot of money, they relied on leisure activities that were cheap or free. So they really liked things like the beach and parks, which is kind of also connected to the Boy Scouts, which I think we mentioned in our previous video. Now, rich people had a lot more options when it came to their leisure time. Rich people had more options for leisure. One of the things that rich people started to do was vacation and travel for leisure. So we start to see the emergence of resort towns that people could go visit just for fun because they had extra money and they could actually go places. Now, this wasn't just for rich people because workers usually got a week off, like a factory would take the week off, and they would all go on vacation together. Usually they would get some sort of a deal and they would go on vacation together to the same resort town. Now, when we think about resort towns, like in America, we might think of like Coney Island in New York. The British version of Coney Island is called Blackpool. But it looks just like Coney Island, but British. Usually, when we think about the working class going on vacations, this is kind of at the end of the 19th century when wages increased. So at first, this was mainly just for rich people And then over time, you could save up enough money and maybe go on a trip. So this is eventually for workers too. But at first, it was just for rich people. Another thing that rich people liked to do was go shopping. And rich people love to go to department stores. And they would spend money on stuff they probably didn't need, but makes them look fancy. Because rich people are still all about status, and so they're going to buy things like hats and gloves and perfume. Again, this was stuff that only the richest people could afford in time period one. But now, as everybody gets a little bit wealthier, everyone could at least look at this stuff, and richer people could buy it pretty regularly, all because of an increase in production. Causes prices to go down. So we would see department stores like, if we're thinking about British ones, we could think about Harrods. Harrods is a very famous department store. Selfridges is another one of these famous British department stores. They're still there. You can go visit them. And along with more people buying stuff, all of this consumerism leads to new jobs. So this will be the last thing we talk about here. The capitalist wanted people to know about the stuff they could buy. So we get new kinds of jobs like marketing or advertising. And additionally, and this is the last thing, I promise, with better transportation, we can now ship things faster, which leads to things like the mail order catalog. It was first invented by a British guy whose name was Price Jones. And I think half of the reason I like to talk about mail order catalogs is because I get to talk about Price Jones. So I'm going to stop there because that's pretty much the end of this social stuff. I know we hit a lot of things here about leisure time. So I'm going to stop there. In our next video, we're going to kind of look at the dark sides of the social effects of industrialization by looking first at what happened with the abolition of the serfs in Russia, of abolition of serfdom, not the serfs. The serfs were still there, and the Irish potato famine. So two very dark periods of the Industrial Revolution, but we'll do that in our next set of videos. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.